This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video is part 2, covering lectures 13 to 24 from Seminar 4. In the previous video, we addressed the function of castration as a lack bearing on an imaginary object and how a failure of the castrating agent to intervene forces the child to manufacture one in the form of the phobic object. In today's video, we'll address the function of the father in castration and how the signifier facilitates a transfer of the function of the father to that of the phobic object. Who is the father? This is a key question that Lacan raises on several occasions in this section. He admits that there is no easy answer, but to make some progress, we'll need to consider the father as he shows up in the three registers of the imaginary, symbolic, and real, since, as is the case for most of Lacan's concepts, there's never a straightforward path to the commonplace understanding of such a notion. Let's begin with the imaginary father, who enters not at the level of castration, but instead is the one who interrupts the imaginary dialectic of frustration between mother and child with an intervention that introduces privation, a privation that has to do with the mother, but which then propels the subject into a complicated relationship with the father, one that vacillates between a dialectic of aggressiveness and a dialectic of idealization. We find an expression of the imaginary father in the Judeo-Christian God as terrifying and jealous and who threatens with eternal damnation, but also in the God of love and the guarantee of universal order. It is the imaginary father who is the one with which we are constantly in comparison to, who we constantly feel as though we are interacting with. The real father, by contrast, is the agent that threatens symbolic castration. He is in some ways equated with the one we would ordinarily identify as the father, that being Hans's actual biological father, the one who is the bearer of the real penis. Yet, although there is something highly tangible about the real father, we have to resist any equating of the real to a vulgar and naive conception of the empirical. Lacan states, "The child has only ever had a very difficult apprehension of this real father due to the interposition of fantasies and the necessity of the symbolic relationship. Indeed, this is how it is for any human being. If there is one thing that lies at the base and the foundation of all analytic experience, then it's that we find it very hard to apprehend what is most real around us. That is to say, human beings such as they are." Now, what's most important in the case of Hans is not the fact that Hans's father is the real father, but the fact that Hans's father's lack of intervention leads to an attenuated presentation of the real father. And the consequences of this for Hans is that he is made to face the overwhelming anxiety of being completely consumed by his mother. This situation will push Hans to manufacture such a threatening figure in the form of a localized fear, an imaginary object that is the source of his phobia, but that can also organize his experience in a manner that will allow him to more adequately address this anxiety. It will be in this sense that the phobic object is thought to stand in for the father. The symbolic father functions in the life of the subject as a signifier that structures and mediates the symbolic world for the subject. Similar to what he did with the imaginary father, Lacan once again brings in a notion of God as exemplary of this father. But rather than it be the all-powerful, angry God, this is a God as ineffable and incomprehensible otherness. Yet he is also the one who introduces order and law into the chaos of our universe, and the only one who is truly capable of giving the object of satisfaction. In the case of little Hans, Lacan indicates that it was in fact Freud who, in some ways, played this role, even though it was initially implemented in an unsatisfactory manner. Now let's think about how Freud functioned in this case. He was a point of reference for Hans and his father someone to appeal to beyond Hans's actual father. And he was, in a sense, pulling the strings behind the curtain from a distance, directing the father as to what to say to his son. He's apprehended both as an all-knowing and supreme witness essential to the truth of Hans's situation. Without the Symbolic Father and his institution of a rule-governed system of signifiers, one would be unable to even deploy language at all. Lacan goes so far as to say that proclaiming there is no God in this very voicing of language amounts to performing a self-contradiction. Now, Lacan is clear that he's not espousing any kind of deism here. Instead, what he is suggesting is that in the expression of language and in there being anything meaningful in that language, there necessarily entails specific laws or rules that are governed by a symbolic authority. An authority that transcends and oversees the flow of symbolic exchanges among subjects. This can be very abstract and difficult to get our minds wrapped around, so I'll use an example that comes to mind. Right now, I'm talking to you. You, who in my psychic world primarily exist as a product of my mind. Imaginary partners constructed out of fragments of my own past experiences and those limited but real interactions I've had with some of you in, say, the comments section. What determines here what I say and how I say it? Well, an obvious response could be, I am determining what I'm saying to you. I am trying to give you knowledge I've gained and that I'm sharing it with you. That's an imaginary understanding of the situation, and one that really doesn't hold much water when we actually think about the logical structure of this exchange. That's because for there to be any sort of effective communication, a genuine transaction of signifiers, what I say has to obey certain norms, to be ordered in a manner that obeys the demands of a symbolic order that mediates my relationship with you. So when I'm coming up with what to say to you, in part, I'm constantly asking myself, or more accurately being confronted by the question, is this what Lacan is saying? Am I faithfully representing Lacan's thought to you? And what questions are you, the audience, perhaps asking? For those of you who are here because you want to learn about Lacan's thought, you very well may be asking a similar question. Is this what Lacan is saying? Is this YouTuber faithfully representing his thought to us? And here we have a similar situation as we find with the case of little Hans. Just as Freud functioned as the symbolic father mediating the relationship between Hans and his father, so too Lacan, the dead father, is functioning as a symbolic figure mediating the relationship between you and me right now. These questions arising from a place beyond our imaginary relationship structures the discourse. Without it, not only would all hope for meaningful exchange be lost, but it could also be a very anxiety-provoking situation because the lack of this structuring influence of a symbolic figure leads to one being lost in a sea of infinite information with no sense as to how to navigate through it. Now you may be thinking to yourself, I'm not concerned with how faithful this is to Lacan as I am with how applicable the content is for another purpose, social theory, clinical practice, etc. And indeed, as the one presenting this material, I'm not only faced with a question concerning Lacan, but also other symbolic authorities whose questions confront me as well. Societal authorities that ask such questions as, what is the scientific evidence for these ideas? What practical difference do these ideas make in our lives? How much do these ideas promote or detract from matters of inclusion and social justice, etc.? These questions, for better or worse, also have a structuring influence on my speech and mediate communication between you, the audience, and myself, sometimes in conforming with the law behind the question, or sometimes in my rebelling against the question, which, as is the case for most rebellions, is still determined by the law it purportedly rejects. And this actually opens up an interesting question. I've posited multiple symbolic authorities here, and yet when Lacan speaks of such authority, it seems to always be in the singular rather than plural. Does the function of symbolic authority ultimately come down to a single figure for every subject? Or is one symbolic world sometimes, if not most often, governed by a multiplicity of symbolic authorities? Regardless of how many symbolic authorities I might have to endure, there does seem to always be a first authority, the one through whom my subjectivity is first castrated, and through whom all other subsequent authorities must be filtered. And here, I think we've stumbled upon another crucial figure connected to the Father, that being the superego, a concept that Lacan further elaborates for us in these lectures. The superego is the formation in which the Oedipus complex naturally culminates. Interestingly, Lacan connects the superego to the notion of Verwerfung, which you might recall from Seminar 3 if you watch those videos, is a defining act that establishes the structure of psychosis. Now here, the superego consists of that element of the law that has been repudiated and makes its reappearance in the real. However, unlike psychosis, the subject here has indeed passed through castration, and by and large has internalized and been structured by the symbolic. As such, this element, what elsewhere he calls an element of the law that has been misrecognized, resides at a borderline for the psyche, manifesting as an overwhelming and oppressive voice, one not encountered entirely outside the subject, but which nonetheless has a foreign quality to it, the voice of moral conscience. As it becomes instantiated in each individual, this figure of the superego is perhaps where every other authority in the subject's life bows down and conforms to, functioning perhaps as a kind of funnel or sieve through which all other laws must pass. As Lacan states, this tyrannical superego, in itself fundamentally paradoxical and contingent, represents in itself alone, even in non-neurotics, the signifier that leaves its mark and imprint on man, that seals his relations with the signifier. So what then is the signifier? It's worth repeating that signifiers are not equivalent to the meanings that get connected to them, the signifieds. And indeed, the fact that one encounters a certain ambiguity about meaning is a signal that we are in the presence of a signifier. Rather than be defined in terms of their signifieds, signifiers or signifier elements are to be first considered in terms of their movements, transformations, and especially their relations with other signifier elements, forming a symbolic structure. To consider a proper approach to the signifier, it's helpful to look at a pervasive misconception pertaining to psychoanalytic interpretation. For example, it is commonly thought that the aim of dream analysis is to get at the latent content beneath the manifest content. That is, to arrive at the deeper meanings behind the superficial presentation of images in the dream. But this is far from accurate. If anything, I should be asking the inverse question. Why is it that a latent content took on the particular manifest content that it did? It's not wondering why the dream of being chased by a scary monster is about one's mother, but rather why one's mother would be represented in the dream as a scary monster chasing you. Even more accurate, we have to consider how the monster, as a signifier, is connected to other signifier elements in the dream. The fact that it is chasing, the fact that it is hairy, the fact that it is chasing you in the morning rather than the night, etc. Dreams and symptoms constitute constellations of signifiers that are constantly moving, being transferred, and transformed. And in doing so, they come to organize and even produce meanings that get attached to these signifier acts. It would be helpful to see here how Lacan connects this function of the signifier to the structure of myth. Since its inception, psychoanalysis has drawn from mythology as a source for its theoretical formulations, most famously the story of Oedipus. The connection between patricide and incest can only make sense on a mythological level. And a reason why Oedipus has played such a central role in psychoanalysis is not that it uncovers some hidden meaning of early child-parent interactions, but that it has, in a manner few other myths have done, elucidated a widespread structural dynamic at work in the emergence of subjectivity, especially in Western civilization where patriarchy has long been and continues to be a predominant mode of social authority and power. Lacan mentions that myth is thought to function like a Kantian transcendental schema. What's important about such schemas is not their specific content, but instead the manner in which that content is consistently represented and organized into recognizable and predictable patterns. This structure then has a truth value independent of the specific content. Similarly, myth is thought to contain elements that form recurring patterns, and these patterns are not specific to the particular narrative told, but contain some more generalizable truths pertaining to the human condition. Just as there are collective myths, subjects develop their own personal myths, not unrelated to the collective ones, by which they come to structure their experience. And certain mythological constructions give rise to symptomatic expressions. There is in the neurotic's individual myth a progressive dislocation and series of mediations that gets bound up in a tightly knit circular chain of signifiers. The consequent proliferations of mythological elements constituted along this circle, or what Lacan will also call the child's mythical fomentations, presents the opportunity for an analysis of its constituent elements. We can see this at play in the case of little Hans, who produces all sorts of mythical constructions, and not just of the horse. There is his story of the lumps, his fantasies concerning a plumber who comes and unscrews the bath and who sticks a borer into Hans's stomach, the make-believe children that Hans has, and the idea of his father marrying Hans's grandmother, the father's mother, while Hans marrying his own mother. Then, of course, there is the mythological construction of the horse, who bites or falls, who has a carriage behind it, who has something black around its mouth. In analyzing Hans's phobia, Lacan encourages us to ask not what the meaning of the symptom is, but instead to ask, how is this symptom produced? What is the function of the symptom? And where does this symptom fit within a larger structural pattern? It is a matter of analyzing the particular mythological structure of the neurotic subject. Perhaps the horse represents Hans's wild and uncontrollable desire for his mother, or represents the figure of the father who threatens castration, etc. It's not that these interpretations are completely off the mark or unimportant, but they fail to consider the deeper structural patterns within which the horse is located and its relation to other signifier elements. All of this leads to some surprisingly concrete direction for analytic work. Lacan warns against understanding clinical material too quickly, by which he means hastily giving a meaning to it. Instead, he recommends jotting down brief notes and recording day by day the signifier elements that emerge, paying careful attention to how they form particular sequences and repeating patterns, considering how signifier elements are defined in relation to other signifier elements. Critical to doing this psychoanalytic work is being constantly vigilant toward the distinction between the signifier and signified, trying not to confuse them. In light of this, it's helpful to keep in mind that meanings are not always clear, and it's certainly not stable in the presence of a signifier. And in contrast, signifiers have a certain materiality about them. You may not be able to touch, see, hear, or taste a meaning, but in some ways you can a signifier. And so psychoanalysis is not about meaning analysis, but structure analysis. Or to put it in Wittgensteinian terms, it is to engage in a kind of grammatical investigation, by which is meant a discovering of the rules governing the use of signifier elements within a language game, which here concerns the particular mythology at play in the life of the neurotic individual. The next and final video of Seminar 4 will focus specifically on the phobic object itself, how the fear associated with phobias is distinct from anxiety, and how the structural unfolding of this phobia is represented by Lacan through a series of abstract algebraic formulas. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. If you have a phobic response to Lacan's formulations, You might want to prepare yourself for the next video, as we're going to get into all those numerous formulas that he presents us at the end of Seminar 4. So thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.